This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. The Lord of the Rings is one of those special pieces of literature that has grown far beyond the author's original intent. The Lord of the Rings has been used to contribute to a whole range of different conversations, but one of the most significant is probably that of environmentalism. Now, I'm not going to try and claim that Tolkien himself was an environmentalist, at least by modern definitions, and he never claimed to be one during his lifetime. But underlying The Lord of the Rings is this layer of care and concern for the natural world and its protection. Inspired by Tolkien's own life and times, The Lord of the Rings explores and critiques different environmental philosophies. It emphasizes the horror of environmental devastation, and it gently suggests a couple of methods for how one might repair their broken relationship with nature and move forward. I feel like I kind of had to film this video outside because, you know, it's about the environment, but it is bound to start raining at any moment, so I didn't want to go any further than my backyard. So you get to see the side of my beautiful, kind of dead mid-February backyard. But I did just refill the bird feeder and the squirrel feeder, so we'll see if we get any visitors. So apologies in advance for any technological difficulties or background noises and cars going by. We're all doing our best here. One of the Lord of the Rings' most striking environmental philosophies comes from the trees themselves. Tolkien had, since a very young age, been fascinated with trees. He climbed them, he drew them, but he was also deeply concerned about them. As he explained in one of his letters, every tree has its enemy, but very few have an advocate. So, in The Lord of the Rings, he was able to make trees their own advocates. This can be found as early as the run-in with Old Man Willow, the tree in the old forest that swallows the hobbits whole for daring to sleep on its roots. There's this sense that, as docile and non-sentient as trees seem to be, in this fantasy realm, they have a little bit of bark and bite. But the true king of the forest is ents. In fact, ents were created specifically to protect green growing things. At the very beginning of time, during the creation period, men, elves, and dwarves, the children of Iluvatar, were given dominion over all existing things in Arda. Ents were awakened in order to sort of balance that equation, to keep mankind in check. Sure, in order for humanity to progress, some plants must die. They must be cleared, they must be farmed, they must be harvested, and they must be burned. But ents would always be there, ready to step in if things got a little bit too out of hand. This puts them curiously at odds with everyone in Middle-earth, even the good guys. As Treebeard explains to Merry and Pippin, I am not altogether on anybody's side, because nobody is altogether on my side, if you understand me. Nobody cares for the woods as I care for them. The ents embody a philosophy which could loosely be called preservationism. So that means that if conservation is advocating for the proper use of nature, preservationism advocates for nature not to be used at all. And especially since this is the perspective taken up by ents, it makes a certain kind of sense. The ents come from an age when all of Middle-earth was swallowed up by forests, when trees and plants were able to reign unchecked. And while elves and men are considered the firstborn and secondborn respectively, you could make a fair argument that, truthfully, those plants are really the firstborn. They were there long before men ever walked on the earth, and the thought that they would be controlled or governed or caged in and cut down by something so small and so young in the grand timeline of the world, it's understandable that there would be a little bit of rage there. It's honestly kind of remarkable. But as admirable as the preservationist mindset of the ents is, it's simply not achievable for really anyone who isn't an ent. In fact, this is such a limiting and stringent perspective that it even alienates some of ent kind. Treebeard tells Merry and Pippin the tale of the Entwives. Our hearts did not go on growing the same way. The Ents gave their love to things that they met in the world, and the Entwives gave their thought to other things. For the Ents loved the great trees and the wild woods. But the Entwives gave their mind to the lesser trees, and to the meads in the sunshine beyond the feet of the forests. They did not desire to speak with these things, but they wished them to hear and obey what was said to them. The Entwives ordered them to grow according to their wishes, and bear leaf and fruit to their liking. For the Entwives desired order and plenty and peace, by which they meant that things should remain where they had set them. So the Entwives made gardens to live in. The Entwives stayed in their gardens, sharing their knowledge of agriculture with humans and elves, while the Ents continued to wander their wild forests. And eventually, the two groups were lost to each other forever. The tragedy of the Entwives is used to lay bare the limitations of the Ents' preservationist mindset. Whilst it is a powerful, and as the books demonstrate, necessary force, it is far too limiting to be universal. But you know what couldn't possibly be considered limiting? The cutting-edge website-making technology available to you from this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. Squarespace makes it so easy to communicate with and manage your audience using their email campaigns, where you can set up automated emails to build connections while saving yourself time, and you can easily integrate your products into email templates. With their Acuity scheduling feature, you can use Squarespace to book and manage your appointments, accept payments, send automatic reminders, and do so much more. And even better, you can handle all of your payments directly from your Squarespace site. It's so simple, you can get started in just a few clicks, and you can start receiving payments right away. You can even offer extra payment methods like Klarna, Afterpay, Apple Pay, and ClearPay. If you're interested in refreshing an established brand or building yourself an entirely new platform, you should give Squarespace a try. Just head on down to squarespace.com for a totally free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Jess of the Shire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. But the Ents are not the only environmental philosophy that Tolkien presents us with. We also see the elves, who take the stand that they want to value nature for its own sake. We never hear of the elves farming or pruning the Malorn trees or laying down fertilizer. Rather, they take the perspective of looking at plants as they were in the old days, in the very beginning of time. The two great trees of Valinor, Lorelin and Telperion, were not planted or planned or pruned. They simply sprung up because that was Iluvatar's will. And these trees were not there to produce fruit or to be used or to be grown to a certain size and cut down and burned. Rather, they were to be admired and enjoyed by all, their light illuminating even the darkest corners of Arda. Elves have made their very best effort to preserve this effervescent beauty through the ages. In her garden of Lothlorien, Galadriel grows beautiful Malorn trees, inspired by the silver and gold of Lorelin and Telperion. In the bounds of Lothlorien, the seeds of the past flourish in the present, and it is the magic of Galadriel's ring that allows this beauty to flourish. Legolas makes special note of the secret power that fends off evil from the borders of Lothlorien. The ageless beauty of elven nature repels evil just as the light of the trees once did, and the maintenance of these perfect, timeless pockets of growth is key to staving off the rot that threatens to overwhelm Middle-earth. But even this elven let's call it horticulture, has its drawbacks. As Anne M. Martinez explains in her article on elven centrism, the astounding nature within the elven bioregions does not typically benefit outsiders. Like the royal parks of the Middle Ages, these realms are marked off and separate, forbidding entry to those beyond the community. Elven bioregions keep nature in, protected, and people out. The magic of elven nature cannot, by its very nature, be universal. Their philosophy could not be adopted by everyone in Middle-earth because it is very specific to them, to who they are and what they remember. And when the elves leave Middle-earth, they take their magic and those very special plants with them. The magic of their gardens was not truly lasting, not truly sustainable. For a truly sustainable mindset, we have to look towards the hobbits. The hobbits are not what we would call preservationists or horticulturalists. Rather, they've adopted a very mindful method of agriculture. They do use the environment around them. It's how they eat, how they build, and how they keep warm in the winter. But they take only what they need and only need what they take. You could call it a lack of ambition or even laziness, but the fact is that they don't want any more than what they need. And that is a beautiful thing. They love peace and quiet and good tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. The hobbits seem to have an almost inbuilt understanding of their mutually beneficial relationship with the land that they live on. Perhaps it's because they walk around barefoot all the time, but they have this connection to it. They understand it as something alive, important, and precious. If they don't care for their fields, how will they grow? This isn't necessarily the purity of preservationism, nor the aesthete appreciation of the elves. The hobbits like their environment because they get something back from it, but they aren't naive or arrogant enough to assume that they can just keep taking and never give anything back. It is telling that the wealthy man Bilbo does all of his own chores. He does the cooking, he does the cleaning, presumably he does his own laundry, although we never get to see that. But the one thing that he hires someone to do is the gardening. This is such a precious task that it must have a specialized person, an expert to take care of it. In their own unique way, the hobbits sanctify nature whilst still cultivating it and, yes, using it. Now, I'm not going to try and tell you that the Shire isn't a bit idealized, that it's not a bit unrealistic. It's a well-known fact that the Shire is modeled after pre-industrial English countryside villages, but admittedly that modeling is done with a bit of a rose tint. Tolkien wasn't alive back in the 1850s before the Industrial Revolution took hold. He was born in the 1890s, which means that he's looking back on that time as a fond memory, not as a realistic approach to what life was like at this time. But even despite that rose coloring, the Shire does have its own fair share of issues. The people are small-minded, they're suspicious of outsiders and oddities, and perhaps they are a bit too unambitious. And on top of all of that, they, just like us, are vulnerable to corruption. And this is something that Tolkien saw play out in his own lifetime. Tolkien was born in 1892, and he lived through what was basically the culmination of the Industrial Revolution. During his lifetime, over 3% of the total landmass of England was deforested, Thousands of acres of land had been rendered infertile by steel and iron production, and the air was so polluted that it was killing people en masse. In 1952, the Great Smog of London descended, coating the city in noxious fumes, leaving a reported 4,000 people dead in just 5 days, with likely thousands more people permanently affected by the smog. All across Europe, because of the potent cocktail of war and industrialization, native forests were being felled, the air and water were being poisoned, and the rural, agricultural way of life that many had lived for thousands of years had been rendered a remote impossibility. Tolkien felt the impact of this directly and in a very personal way. He had been raised in the English countryside, in a little untouched pocket of land. He and his brother spent their childhood playing in the forest and valleys, and his mother filled his mind with tales of even older days, when all of Europe was green and wild. But this bucolic bliss was shattered by the death of his mother. He and his brother were shipped off into the city, and Tolkien felt that the green, pastoral countryside of his youth had been severed from him forever. In Tolkien's official biography, Humphrey Carpenter recounts, Ronald, still numb from the shock of his mother's death, hated the view of almost unbroken rooftops with the factory chimneys beyond. The green countryside was just visible in the distance, but it now belonged to a remote past that could not be regained. He was trapped in the city. His mother's death had severed him from the open air. It's unsurprising how much these descriptions of post-industrial 20th century Europe represent Tolkien's fantasy land of Mordor. If you think about it, the mindset that Sauron had, his techniques of control, were very similar to a lot of the minds that led the Industrial Revolution. The environment is nothing more than a tool to him. He has no true connection to the land. He doesn't depend on it. He doesn't live on it. He doesn't live off of it. He has no real motivation to care for it beyond what it can do for him directly. Under this carelessness, Mordor becomes a sickened, corrupted place, belching out pollution, scraped clear of any green growing things. It is the antithesis of the preservationist or horticulturalist mindsets of the ents and the elves. Sauron sees nature as valueless, and so it suffers, crushed under the weight of his ambition. But as a much more complex presentation of environmental ruin, Tolkien gives us the character of Saruman. Saruman was not always evil, but as he gives way to his ambition, as his own personal gain becomes the most important thing, we see the way that this is reflected in his relationship with nature. The gardens of Isengard give way to factories. Progress becomes the priority, and the natural world is bulldozed in its path. He takes far more than he needs, and that is still not enough. Saruman is the embodiment of industry, chewing away at our souls and destroying the balanced relationship we may have with nature. But the evil of Saruman's reckless industrialization really hits home when it comes in contact with the pastoral balance of the Shire. In the Scouring of the Shire, upon returning home, the hobbits are horrified to find the Shire taken over and ruined by Saruman and his cronies. This was Frodo and Sam's own country, and they found out now that they cared about it more than any other place in the world. Many of the houses that they had known were missing. Some seemed to have been burned down. The pleasant row of old hobbit holes in the bank on the north side of the pool were deserted, and their little gardens that used to run down bright to the water's edge were rank with weeds. Worse, there was a whole line of the new ugly houses, all along poolside where the Hobbiton Road ran close to the bank. An avenue of trees had stood there. They were all gone, and looking with dismay up upon the road towards Bag End, they saw a tall chimney of brick in the distance. It was pouring out black smoke into the evening air. "This is worse than Mordor," said Sam. "Much worse, in a way. It comes home to you, as they say. Because it is home, and you remember it before it was all ruined." "Yes, this is Mordor," said Frodo. "Just one of its works." The thing about environmental damage is that more often than not, it is gradual. It's an insidious process, one that is fairly easy to just explain away. Undoubtedly, Saruman used his silver tongue to convince the hobbits that this is just what progress looks like. You have to get with the times eventually. Yeah, sure, the air is darker and the water is fouler, but that's just the cycles of nature, you know? That just happens sometimes. Environmental destruction can be very hard to notice, except for when you leave a place for a while and come back to it after some time. Merry, Sam, and Pippin return from their journeys to find the Shire a completely changed place, and it's for the worst. Armed with their fresh perspective, they rally up the Shirelings. They remind them of what their home used to look like and what it should look like, and they are able to defeat Saruman, to drive out his influence, and to return the Shire to its patient, plodding progress, with the help of a bit of elven magic. Nostalgia for a past, uncorrupted world isn't just escapism. It can be key to motivating people to notice and act in favor of environmental reform. If the hobbits didn't have a slightly rose-tinted, nostalgic vision of what the Shire was supposed to be, for all we know, they may have folded under the influence of Saruman when they returned. So it was that the somewhat gilded, fantastical memories of Tolkien's pastoral youth drove him to write stories that beautifully capture this feeling of a long bygone green age. And in a fascinating way, The Lord of the Rings can serve a similar purpose of inspiration for the people reading it. We all know that The Lord of the Rings is fantasy. Hopefully. I really hope this isn't the first time you're hearing that. But even though it is fantasy and we know it's not real, we all still yearn for the peace and plenty of the Shire. We long to be in equal communion with the land that we live on. Will we ever successfully recreate the Shire? Probably not. But it's very important to have things to hope towards, to aspire towards. A little bit of optimism in the face of overwhelming odds can go a really long way. In their book, Matthew T. Dickerson and Jonathan Evans explain, before any reforms can be initiated and implemented, the imagination of our culture must be reached, and this is best done through art and literature, especially through myth. Tolkien provides just the sort of highly engaging work of imagination required, one that may play an important role in the transformation of contemporary culture. Environmental advocacy can be a challenging thing to stomach because it is just so far beyond and above what we as individuals are capable of changing. Besides, it's not like any of it is particularly our fault. I didn't invent the internal combustion engine, so I'm not entirely sure why I should be the one held responsible for fixing the harm that it's done. This is the kind of problem that just snowballs. It was affected by every generation that has come before us, and it will continue to be a problem long after you and I are nothing but a memory. And facts like that can make any type of action seem futile. But as Gandalf explains, it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. The approach towards the environment that Tolkien ends up suggesting in The Lord of the Rings is that of stewardship. And this is a notion that Tolkien derives from his Catholic faith, and it's the idea that mankind was given dominion over all other living things, over plants and animals, but he was not necessarily given ownership. Rather, being given dominion means that we have a responsibility of care. We are not lords, we are not kings, we are not tyrants. We are stewards, and it is the duty of a good steward to watch over the kingdom, to watch over the throne, in anticipation of the true king's return. Like hobbits, we are going to use and cultivate and burn and cut down the natural world, but that must all be done with a very particular respect for the natural world. There must be an understanding that we need to take care of it in order for it to take care of us. Okay, despite everything that I've said in this video, I want to make a point that human progress and industry are good. We should be progressing as a society, and the advancements that we have made in technology and medicine have made society better. However, Tolkien argues that these things are not important and lasting in the same way that the natural world is. On Fairy Stories, he explains, "The electric street lamp may indeed be ignored simply because it is so insignificant and transient. Fairy stories, at any rate, have many more permanent and fundamental things to talk about. Not long ago, incredible though it may seem, I heard a clerk of Oxenford declare that he welcomed the proximity of mass production robot factories and the roar of self-obstructive mechanical traffic because it brought his university into contact with real life. The notion that motor cars are any more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive is a factory chimney compared with an elm tree? Poor obsolete thing, insubstantial dream of an escapist. For my part, I cannot convince myself that the roof of Bletchley Station is more real than the clouds." Like I said in the introduction to this video, Tolkien was not an environmentalist, or at the very least, he didn't claim or intend to be one. But you cannot deny that his proposals on the proper and improper relationships that one may have with their environment were and continue to be very pressing and very relevant. What's so much better is that he delivered this thesis through the form of a story, which automatically makes it much more accessible and readable than a lot of philosophical writings. Even if you have never processed The Lord of the Rings using the environmental philosophical terms that I categorized it within today, I bet that you've come away with a lot of the same conclusions that I've reached here, just from reading or watching or consuming this story at arm's length. And I would argue that that is the true enchantment of storytelling. It can make even the most stubborn mind susceptible to new ideas. It can render complex and difficult to swallow ideas familiar, and it can turn something as simple as a tree into pure magic. If you are interested in diving any deeper into this subject, I highly recommend that you check out Ents, Elves, and Eriador, the environmental vision of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's a really great place to start. It's incredibly well written and very comprehensive, and it was a big source for this video. So if you want to check that out, that is linked in my sources with all of my other sources for this video in the description. One of the things that makes the environment of The Lord of the Rings so cool is the sheer range of environments and biomes and plants that we get to encounter. I do think that my loyalties still lie with the Shire in being my favorite environment that we see in The Lord of the Rings, but I would love to hear what your favorite environment in The Lord of the Rings is in the comments below. It did finally start raining out here, so I hope you guys were able to hear some of that because it's quite pleasant and not as cold as it could be. I will say that my hair definitely looks different than it looked at the beginning of the video because of the humidity. I think all my curls fell out, which I guess means it's probably time for me to wrap this up. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it and if you learned something new, and do consider subscribing because I come back here almost every week to talk about the stuff I like to talk about. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.